All right, Josh Singer, congratulations on your recent Oscar nomination for Spotlight. How did it feel when you got the news that you had got your first nomination?
It was pretty exciting. It was pretty exciting. I mean, I will say, as exciting as that was, I think just that whole morning was such a great morning for the movie. I mean, I went to bed the night before thinking if we got five, that would be extraordinary, and we got six, and I was just totally thrilled. It's nice to see them recognize McCardle and obviously Tom, who I just think is one of the best directors working today. So it was it was a fun morning.
Well, definitely. Let's talk about the movie. How did you get involved with the project?
I had written The Fifth Estate about WikiLeaks, and that script, we hadn't made the movie yet, but Michael Sugar, who's my manager, and Steve Golan responded well to the script, and they put it in front of Nicole and Bly, who had brought Spotlight to them. And then they put it in front of Tom, and Tom and I had a Skype chat, not unlike this one. Although I was maybe a little more nervous. I was a big fan of his work. And for me, with The Fifth Estate, I loved researching that project and was always a little sad that, there was a whole other movie there to write about the interaction with Julian and the Guardian guys, which we only just touch on. And I had had such a ball hanging out with Nick Davies and David Lee and all these super terrific reporters over at the Guardian, that when, there was an opportunity to tell another journalism story, I was pretty excited. Also because, in The Fifth Estate, what we tried to talk about was what's happened to journalism in the last 15 years. And for whatever reason, the movie didn't really connect. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. We were still in the process of making it. But I thought, there we're talking about what's happened to journalism. What if we just show great journalism? Show what good local journalism looks like. Maybe we'll wind up having people talk about the issues around all these metro dailies going out of business and all these reporters losing their jobs, just because they'll see what great journalism can do. And fortunately, that's sort of turned out to be the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is quite shocking when you look at this movie and see what journalism was, and you look at what the current state of journalism is. It's almost more of a tabloid thing in a lot of instances.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I think our political discourse right now is at a bit of a nadir. I guess my guess is everyone in their own era says that. But it feels like that somehow, the Twitterverse and the lack of, hard news, good journalism out there has allowed for, a lot of loud voices to pervade with fairly unnuanced views of politics and life. And moreover, I think there are bigger problems than even that, which is that I think, with all these metro dailies going out of business, with all these reporters losing their jobs, there are just less eyes on the powerful. Less people holding folks accountable. I mean, this is why Julian Assange started WikiLeaks back in 2006 and 2007. I mean, he basically saw these reporters losing their jobs, and he's worried who's gonna hold the powerful accountable. And while I don't necessarily agree with everything Julian wound up doing, I think the ideal with which he founded WikiLeaks was pretty noble. And I think I have tremendous concern. I'm from Philadelphia. The Inquirer just laid off 47 people. Right. I sat with Stephen Ray, and he said it's brutal there. And, he talked about just movie reviewers. He said, I think they were, they're down to maybe one reviewer covering all the movies. It's impossible. And, putting that aside, just what kind of eyes are there on government in Philadelphia? What kind of eyes are there on the powerful in Philadelphia? When you've got 47 less reporters on the ground, who's going to hold these people accountable? And I think that is a real problem, and one that we're sort of pointing to, with this film.
Let's talk about it from a storytelling standpoint. Structuring the script, was that difficult?
It was. I mean, they're always challenging, right? I think with this particular script, one of the great things was, I sat down with Mike Resendez, who happened to be in LA, and we spent a week. Every day for a week, I took him out to lunch. And at the end of that week, I had like a 54-page notes document, which essentially served as a real skeleton for the procedural. After that week, I knew we had just a great detective story. I'd worked in procedural television. I knew that the A to B to C to D of this story could be quite compelling. And I wasn't sure, there were too many points, even though it's fairly contained. Most of the reporting took place from, the very end of August of 2001 until September 11th. And then they were off the case, as it were, and then back on as of mid-October. And then our story breaks, we end January 6th. So it's really, you're looking at about, about 6 weeks and then about 2.5 months. And that's actually, compared to, I'm working on a Neil Armstrong biopic now that I'm trying to take 10 years and put it into 2 hours, right? So, when I'm looking at several months, it's a lot easier. We not only had Mike, but then Tom and I spent a lot of time up in Boston. We repeatedly went up and did, interview after interview with the reporters there. Part of that was fleshing out this procedural, and part of that was getting all sorts of great character stuff. But we also then had Robbie, we sent us emails that, the team had sent back and forth, and to Marty at the time. We had articles to look at. We had the actual lawsuit to look at. We had a lot of primary documents, and those documents were actually quite useful in terms of, at some point on Tom's board, we literally had, okay, they talked to Phil Saviano on this date, and then they had that conversation with Marty where he says, I want to go beyond the number of priests of the system on this date. And then, Garabini gives the tip to Mike on September 6th, right before 9/11. And then, so we literally and then we have an email from Mike on the 23rd of October where he's clearly just got the letters. And then we know they hold for, 2.5 months. And so what's happening in that, so we had a lot of dates and bullet points to help us construct the story. I think still there's always the challenge of what to leave out. And I remember, Tom and I were doing a lot of passing back and forth, but I think I was sort of writing ahead, after the initial sort of 60 pages, and then he was sort of writing behind. And I think we had sort of beat out, like 17 different scenes for, the last, 10 minutes of the film. And I wound up cutting through half of them, just driving towards the end. And so I think even with the best, even after laying out structure, there was still work to be done. But again, the reporters were incredibly helpful. The raw materials we had were incredibly helpful. And frankly, that kind of puzzle is one I love to play with. Like, how do you make this story? How do you find the right moments to fit into the story where you're moved along in such a way that, it's compelling and gripping, and you still get the essence of what happened in 2 hours.
Mm-hmm. And you have all these great characters that you're working with too.
Yeah, and I would say if anything was a real challenge, it was Tom had a very strong vision early on of being authentic, of trying to get this right. And I think it was because of the nature of the material and because of, his prior experience working, on The Wire and talking to Simon, and, I think a bit of reverence for the blue collar nature of the work. And so, I remember on our first trip to Boston, we had a conversation about, I was like, maybe you don't have Matt Carroll in the movie. Maybe you just have Mike, and he has a family. And Tom's like, no. I was like, I don't think. I was like, okay, well, what if it's just you don't have Matt, but you have Mike? And I shouldn't say this. Matt's going to be very upset if he sees this. But literally, it was literally first blush. And I was just trying to think, well, how the heck are we going to manage to keep 6 different reporters active and alive when we've got so much procedural story to tell? And, the natural inclination would be to make it more about, 2 or 3 of them. And so what was really quite challenging, at first was trying to wrap my head around that. Tom sent me a movie called Police, which was a French movie that came out back, I think, in 2011, 2012, which actually did a very good job of, it's got like 12 different actors. You don't recognize any of them. They're all famous French actors, nobody I knew. And yet they managed to keep, each of them alive in their own way. And frankly, that sort of gave me an idea of what he was shooting for. And then, the other thing is Tom is so good at character work, and he's so good at, making small moments on the page, really big moments on the stage. And so, I think I didn't quite realize at the time, but I sort of just trusted these little moments would work. And what was amazing was to watch Tom casting this movie and bringing in, these wonderful actors, whether it be, Rachel or Michael or Neil Huff, and getting these moments on the stage that really, you knew spoke volumes. And yes, we had to do several passes where we focus on Ben, and then several passes where we focus on Mike, and several passes where we focus on Sasha. But Tom was so good at getting those performances that I think all those characters sort of dance in the film and stay alive in a way that, I think a lesser director would struggle with,
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that's so great about the movie is that it's restrained. Even though it's about this really kind of lurid subject material, it never exploits it. Can you talk about, as a writer, having that come across on the page?
Yeah, I think that, I think we knew we were dealing with a pretty powerful subject. And I think we knew that a little would go a long way. We always, you're seeing this subject through the eyes of the journalist, which I think is something Nicole and Bly wanted to do from the beginning. And I thought that was very smart, because I think it makes it accessible, and allows you to interact with this very challenging topic. But I think, we were never out to go after the church per se. We wanted to talk about the institution, not necessarily the religion. And I think that, the other thing I would say is that, a good example of this is the first time, so for the Phil Staviano stuff so when we actually spent a lot of time with Phil and with Joe Crowley, who are the two of the three survivors. Well, we meet four survivors in the movie, right? There's Phil, there's Joe, there's Patrick McSorley, who had sadly passed away in 2004, so we couldn't sit down with him. And then the fellow in Providence, who's now come forward, Jim Scanlon. At the time, he was not public, and so we only heard about him through Robbie. So the two survivors we could sit down with, though, we did. And that time spent with Joe and Phil was incredibly valuable. And in fact, when we went to, if you look at, if you listen to the tapes of Phil talking to me or Joe talking to Tom and me, and you look at, the scenes there, it's their language. I mean, literally, Tom took the first pass on the Phil scene, and I took the first pass on the Joe and Patrick stuff. And we literally are just trying to use as much of their language as possible. I'd worked on Law and Order SVU, and you just really didn't have the time to go into detail, right, when dealing with this kind of subject matter. And so you'd make stuff up, and it would come off as television, right? Good television, but television. And I think here we had a real opportunity to sit with these survivors and try to really get a sense of who they were. That all said, my first cut, when I did the first draft of the Joe Crowley, Patrick McSorley back and forth, and my first version had a lot more intercutting. And also I cut away. I didn't cut away to scenes of molestation, but I cut away to, a shot of, ice cream running down Patrick McSorley's arm, just because I thought that graphic was really, that visual was really compelling. And I cut away to, Joe talks about a children's mobile with like names, bisexual, homosexual, transgender, like names on that mobile. And I cut away to that as well. And I sent that to Tom, and Tom basically said, you know what? One, I want to intercut less. I want to be with these actors and just let their stories really hit me. And two, let's try it without the cutaways. You know, they're powerful, but I don't think we need them. I think if we get great actors, we'll be able to get that just from their words and from what they're doing. And I think, you know, his instinct there was right on. I think if we had tried to sort of soup it up in any way, it would have been much less effective. And so, frankly, I think that, somebody once said that the job of a director is tone. And I would say it's tone and storytelling. And that's why I just think Tom's one of the best directors working on the business today, because like the tone he manages to get, it's such a narrow target, I think, with this film, to be both restrained and yet keep it engaging. And I think, both in pushing us on the writing and then getting the, casting, getting the performances out of the actors, working with Masa, our great DP, on, how he's going to shoot this, taking a very Lumet style, long shots, more feeling like you're in the room with these people as opposed to any sort of artifice. And then the way he cut together the film, I think it both is compelling yet incredibly real. And I think that's what makes it so powerful. So I really, every day I'm so thrilled that, I've gotten to work with him and look forward to working with him some more.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly a powerful movie. I'm curious about the ending of it, because it's really surprising the way that it ends, not to give too much away. Was that difficult for you guys to come up with?
I think we always knew, that there was, to us, what was really interesting about the reporters and their journey was that this is the greatest story any of them had ever worked on. And probably I think they'd all probably say it was the greatest story they've worked on. Marty Baron says the greatest story he's worked on, most important story he's worked on. And Marty Baron, is now the editor of the Post. He's overseen all sorts of stories. That's pretty high praise. And I think what was amazing talking to them was both the absolute excitement while they're breaking the story. At oh my God, we've got this story that is enormous. And at the same time, the devastation, because they're all lapsed Catholic and they all know what this story means, to them, but also to the people around them. Sasha's grandmother, Sasha's mother and her grandmother, both very Catholic. And I remember Sasha, when we screened the movie in Boston, our Boston premiere, Sasha's mother flew out with Sasha's sister. And Sasha was nervous because she knew her mother still goes to church every day. And the highest praise I got that night was from Sasha's mother, who said, this is good work, I think that, I think the ending really tries to capture both the extreme triumph of what happened when this story came out, and yet also the devastation at what the story was, and also again the devastation and the complicity, right? And this is the bigger thing that Tom and I were always shooting for. I mean, everyone knows the church has not been a great actor here. I think nobody quite knows to what extent the church is still not a great actor, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think what people what struck me about the story from the very beginning was how many people around the church, enabled this, right? How many lawyers and cops and newspaper folks let this go on? I talked to a buddy who grew up in Dorchester about this story when I was first starting on it. He's like, there's no story there. Everybody knew it was happening. And I was like, exactly. That's the story, right? And to me, that is the bigger story that goes beyond just this. And this is why, yes, I've had, it's amazing. In 1 week, I got an email from a survivor of clergy sex abuse, a guy who I knew from college, but hadn't talked to in years. And I also got an email from someone I went to high school with who was just a survivor of abuse more generally. And I think that's where it gets broader, because I think if you look at what happened with Jimmy Savile in the BBC, if you look at Jerry Sandusky in Penn State, if you look at Bill Cosby, whenever there is abuse like this by a good institution or a good figure, people look away. They want to look away. They don't want to go there. And in fact, this is something that I actually think is a problem right now with this movie, actually. There's been a lot of articles written about the journalism and about the need for more journalism, and a lot of lovely articles about the filmmaking. And there have been very few articles about, well, what is the church doing now? And how, and is the church doing enough to protect its flock now. And the folks at SNAP and Bishop Accountability would tell you no. The church is not, Mitch Garabedian and Phil Saviano did a local Boston program right in the wake of this coming out. And they basically said the church is not doing nearly enough. They need to be much more transparent. They need to hold people accountable. The Pope announced that he's got this, council that's going to hold prelates accountable. We don't know who's on it. We don't know what the penalties are. They haven't held anyone accountable as far as I know, right? And, thinking about transparency, there are 178 dioceses in the country. We know over 100 of them have had incidences of clergy sex abuse. Only 30 some have published lists of accused priests. How is that possible, right? Only 30 some have published lists of accused priests. How would you not want those? Look at Megan's Law, right? We want names of people out there just so they can't do more harm. And the church isn't taking even that basic measure, at least not. I mean, look, 30 some of the dioceses are, and a couple more in the last couple of weeks. Seattle, Minnesota, have come out with these lists. But we need, dioceses all around the country to do that, not to mention all around the world. So I think the church could be and should be doing much more. And I think the fact that we're not talking about that, again, speaks to this larger issue of why do we look away? Why do we just let this happen?
Mm-hmm. No, I agree completely. And one of the things that struck me the most as I go out and I talk to people about the movie is that many of them are lapsed Catholics or they are active Catholics. And a lot of them have had experiences like the ones that the survivors had in this movie, or they've known somebody, or they've had a family member, and I think part of it is the fact that, at least for a lot of them, these priests are such figures in their lives.
Right.
These are people who come to their home for dinner, or,
Right. And I think you can't underestimate the power. I think one of the things, when I first sat down with Phil, one of the things that struck me, you read about these stories, but until you really get in there, you don't really understand, at least for me. And I had no understanding, let alone like the psychology of why this happens and why it why it happens frequently, had happened in the past, and that continues to happen, I believe, frequently in the church. Putting that psychology aside, just talking to Phil and hearing, and even like talking to John Albano, who's the lawyer for the church and grew up in who's the lawyer for the Globe, and who grew up in Western Massachusetts and like in one of these very Catholic areas, and he said, like Phil said, the priest was God. You really thought he was someone who was you thought of him as God, and so one, obviously you're going to do whatever he tells you to do. But there is physical devastation and emotional devastation, but the spiritual devastation here. You're in a community where it's not a question: do you believe in God? You all believe in God. This is a community that